digital sign-in. In terms of agenda item number 2, which is apologies for absence, we've got apologies from Richard Clark. Any other apologies to note? Don't think so. Councillor Susan Morgan joined us on the via the link, being very formal. Hi, Sue. You okay? So declarations of interest. Any declarations to note?
Thank you, Lisa. I have no advice to provide members with this morning. If, however, any issues arise during discussions, then please let me know at that stage.
Great, thank you. Anything to raise there? No. In that case, we move on to confirmation of Cabinet minutes from the 14th of February. Is everyone happy with those? Any issues anyone wants to raise with those? Presumably not. Updates on action. Anything to note there? Anything outstanding we need to note on that list? Don't believe so. So item 6 then is the Public Protection Service Enforcement and Compliance Policy Update. So if I hand over initially to Mandy on this one.
Thank you, Leader. The report before you relates to the Council's Public Protection Service Enforcement and Compliance Policy. It gives details of the approach taken to delivering the regulatory functions in accordance with legal frameworks such as the Regulator's Code. The policy demonstrates our commitment as a Council to the principles of good regulation, working with businesses and the community to secure compliance with the regulations which we are responsible for enforcing. This policy covers the enforcement practices which are undertaken by environmental health, trading standards and licensing. It has recently been reviewed to ensure that it is compliant with the law and that it still remains relevant. The updated version also includes the approach to civil parking enforcement, and some changes have been made and some additional text inserted to provide some clarification. The Licensing Committee approved the updated draft policy as it relates to the enforcement of licensing provisions on the 16th of February. I commend this report to Cabinet, and I know John Clements is here if there's any questions from anyone.
Thanks, Mandy. Over to Rachel.
Thanks, Leader. Nothing much further to add. This is obviously a policy which the officers use when they're out doing their inspections, and how we look to always have a prevention-first approach with regards to inspections and enforcement. And for most cases, enforcement is the act of last resort, but obviously on some things, you know, fly tipping, for example, where we are able to catch people, then clearly that is something which we look to use our powers immediately to bring forward prosecutions. You'll have noticed over the last year, actually, there's been quite a big increase in terms of the amount of prosecutions that are going forward across the whole spectrum, particularly trading standards, food hygiene, and that's a concerted effort by the team to ensure our public are protected and safe, and that we have good businesses practising in the borough. But we have to remember that for every one prosecution, there's many hundreds of businesses doing a fab compliance job out there. And I think it's that for us to remember that as we move forward. We're doing this to ensure good, safe, reliable, trustworthy businesses and food within the borough, and everything. You know, the last thing we actually want is prosecution, because it means that people aren't doing what they want to. You know, the policy is there, and that is what we are. We were working in we are following the policy well. We don't have appeals in terms of the operation from the service when it's going forward. We've been really successful in the last year or so about getting costs being awarded back to us as well from the courts to enable us to go forward. And Mandy has regular briefings on the sorts of cases we've got going forward. In terms of any technical details about the operation of the policy, as Mandy has said, John is here. Unfortunately, Dan is on leave, otherwise he would have been here today. But just happy to commend the report and the policy to Cabinet.
Thank you, Rachel. Any questions, members? It's really good to hear about the successful record on appeals and costs, and that approach that prosecutions are the last resort. I guess that's always something that's made more difficult by resource. I'd just like to thank the team certainly for the work they did during the pandemic. And I guess my question is, I don't know if this is for John, but how's the experience sort of differed coming back after the pandemic, and that obviously the focus then was on enforcement of pandemic restrictions, things, and now it's turned back to general day-to-day enforcement of food standards. So what's the experience sort of working with local businesses like there?
I think it was a sort of climb back experience, really, Councillor, in terms of there was a bit of a deterioration, particularly in the food sector, that we noticed, and we had to sort of get that back to where it should be. So it took us a bit of time to get the sort of compliance levels right in that sector from our inspections that we kick-started after the pandemic. So it just shows you if there isn't regulation, then there will be deterioration in terms of standards. That's one of the main things that we noticed, I would say.
Great. So I guess the negative of that proves that the good work that you do through the inspection regime. So just thank you for the work you do, and just thank you to John, to Dan and the team for everything they do in that respect. Any other questions, members, before we move to a vote on this? Okay, the recommendations are at paragraph 8.1. It's that Cabinet notes the review of the existing Public Protection Service enforcement and compliance policy, and secondly, that we approve the draft updated Public Protection Service enforcement and compliance policy be adopted by the Council as in line with Licensing Committee's approval. So we all okay in favour of that? That's carried unanimously. Thank you, John, and thank you, Rachel and Mandy, for that report.
Very much.
Okay, if we move next to agenda item 7, which is the Project Apollo Energy Savings Project report. And if I hand over initially again to Mandy on this.
Thank you, Leader. This item is seeking Cabinet approval to establish a 2-year programme of work which seeks to deliver significant energy consumption reductions across the Council's owned and operated property portfolio. The report sets out the Apollo Energy Savings Programme, which responds to the nature and climate emergency which was declared in Council back in September 21. Reducing energy consumption contributes to the delivery of the Emergency Action Plan, our goal of reaching net zero by 2030, and reducing the budgetary pressures from escalating energy prices. We as a Council have been reporting our carbon emissions since 2019-20 through a Welsh Government mechanism. Our original carbon footprint on our property portfolio is calculated as being 8,100 tonnes, and our most recent completed assessment for 21-22 was calculated as 6,600 tonnes of carbon, which is a reduction of 19%. This demonstrates a strong initial performance of our journey to becoming net zero 2030, and I'm really pleased that Welsh Government carried out a recent analysis and indicated that we are one of the strongest performing local authorities for carbon emissions associated with buildings, so it's really good news. However, escalating energy costs will potentially create a budget pressure of up to 3.5 million next year, so I asked officers to develop this programme of work. The Project Apollo Energy Savings Programme seeks to deliver energy savings of 300,000 next financial year through a range of work streams, which include improving efficiency, behaviour change and increasing renewable energy regeneration. It will also seek to develop a rolling programme of works over the coming years so that the Council will be in a good position to be on the way of reaching the net zero 2030 target. The programme will result in a data-led approach, will reduce the financial consequences of escalating fuel costs and also support the Council's transition to net zero 30. The report sets out our approach to reducing our energy consumption, and I recommend the Cabinet approve the proposals. I'll now hand over to Mark Thomas to go through the report in more detail, but before I do, I'd just like to say thank you to Mark Wren and the team for the hard work on developing this programme and getting us to the point we are now with our targets and plans going forward.
Thank you, Councillor. I'm glad to have Gren with me as well, obviously, who's been the workhorse of this process as well, and reporters pulled the report together. So, Gren, thank you very much for your assistance on that. As Mandy said, really, the report and the proposals are part of a package, an ongoing package of works intended to support Project Apollo, which is designed to address the significant financial challenges that the authority faces, but also to make a step change in terms of how we progress towards meeting our 2030 and 2050 targets in terms of climate and the nature emergency. As Councillor Owen has said, really, it's split up into 4 work streams. and the sort of we've got a phased approach in terms of how we're going to address this challenge and obviously produce obviously budget savings. As Councillor Owen said, really a targeted approach in terms of behaviour change. There's going to be some resource needed there to support our colleagues and to work with schools and our major buildings that are emitting the most sort of energy and try to reduce carbon savings on that. Increase renewable energy as well, so that's looking at PV panels and mainly focusing on schools and our significant buildings such as T-Blind Depot. And then obviously looking at how we manage our buildings more efficiently as well in terms of putting in set sort of data information as well, so that we can obviously look at our energy generation and adopt optimal operation procedures there as well to save funding and obviously reduce our carbon footprint. And then the last one also the deep carbon savings as well, and that's looking at our sort of primary buildings that are the biggest generators of energy to really drive down and make them sort of optimum efficiency in terms of that process. There's a detail in terms of funding as well. There's going to be a mixed blend of how we fund this programme. One is going to be from sort of looking at available grant funding, and the team's been very successful in gaining grant funding to support our aspirations. That will continue throughout the next couple of years. We also have a climate reserve fund, which we will dip into to sort of support those and sort of match fund where appropriate further grant funding. And really, that's the process we have in place. The first 2 years that we have sort of detailed plans, and as we roll forward then we'll have a series of developments so that we can bring forward further improvements as the years go forward. As the Cabinet member said, we're obviously driving towards the 2030 target of obviously net zero. I trust that's acceptable, and if you have any further questions, I'd be happy to assist.
Thank you all. Any questions on this? Peter?
Just one question, please. You say in the report on 8.3 that we're going to use Climate Reserve Fund to temporarily fund an officer post, which is good. Going forward, is it likely that this post will become permanent? I'm just thinking, you know, the need for savings is likely to continue beyond 2 years. I just wondered, have you got any thoughts on that, please?
Yeah, I'll answer that if that's okay. It's a very pertinent question. It's something we did consider when we were developing the programme, and we thought it's best to be cautious for the first 2 years to be able to quantify precisely how much this saving will be making, and then be in a position to potentially make a very, very strong business case for continuation of that funding. I think partly what it was, we didn't want to make this a decision that was done in perpetuity. What we're trying to do is reflect our investment strategy is going to be based on good rate of returns, proven savings, but it's our assumption that we will then potentially be able to prove how well we're doing. So I'm just aware that my microphone is not doing too well, so I'm just going to change my settings.
That's fine, thank you.
On the back of that, Councillor Jones, we've had this debate about sort of the resource we need to deliver this programme and how much more we would need to scale up. I think this temporary, we've got some offers, we've got quite a small team at the moment. This temporary post is to look to do some of the more, particularly the data-led side. And we've got some good data systems in some of our sites, but not across all of our sites. So actually, that's what that person's going to be doing, is getting those data systems in, getting them set up. That will free one of our more senior officers now, so he can then focus on doing some of this big change and project management side. Because once we've got the data system set up across all our sites, that almost looks after itself. So that is some of the thinking. As you say, it's data-led. It's got to be data-led. A lot of our data at the moment comes from our energy bills rather than direct from the sites where we haven't been able to invest in the technology to put on the boilers and the heating systems, and that's what we're looking to do through this programme, hence why it's a fixed term at the moment. And we would be looking, if in time, that the energy savings that we could generate from us being more data-led would actually then pay for that post. It, in turn, is the aspiration.
Thanks both. Sue.
Thank you, Leader. I'm just interested in the balance to be struck between what's obviously an imperative to reach net zero, which is an important goal in itself, but also the imperative to identify efficiencies and savings. And given the fluctuations in the energy market, how difficult is it proving to calculate payback periods on this investment?
I'll answer that. It's always relatively tricky. Historically, we were able to calculate that. We'll assume inflationary increase of 1-2% per annum on your energy bills. It's fundamentally changed. What we're not doing at this time is making requests for a long-term capital investment program, because it may well, as you're alluding to, energy prices may halve in 3 years' time, so it wouldn't make financial sense to make that commitment now based on next year's projected energy prices. So which is why, as part of this proposal, we'll be looking to come back to council on an annual basis and saying, okay, this is our projection of what is the best rate of return will be, whether that's on efficiency, whether that's on generation. So it's deliberately being done on an annual basis, making as Rachel alluded to, with the best available data at the time. What we can be reasonably certain of is energy prices will not go as low as they were a year ago. I think that's fair to say, and they're probably going to be somewhere between where they were and where they are now, which is why our next investment request in a year's time, we should have a lot of clarity on what that will be. But fundamentally, yes, decent investment is key. And as you alluded to, this is net zero for 2030. So what we're not looking to do as part of that balance is looking to reduce carbon at all costs, when actually it's much more cost effective to net that off, for example, from the sequestration we find from our parks and so on and so forth. It's not zero carbon we're looking to achieve. It's finding that right balance.
Okay, thank you. And Fiona.
I note that it's only for council-owned and run buildings, so you probably already know what I'm going to ask. Is there an opportunity going into the future to look at those smaller sites? So I know that there's SRS and TLT noted as separate pieces of work, and being a member of TLT before, I remember the SALEX funding we were looking at before, but the council obviously supporting. And I'm thinking smaller scale in terms of community halls. Those kind of, I know they're the smaller buildings and they're not going to give you the massive impact, but in terms of their requirements, sometimes they might have dated technology, sometimes they may not have the resource, sometimes they do, but they just don't have the skill set to actually deliver what they need, whether it be solar power, whatever it might be. So is there consideration in the future, because I recognise this is a very big and very positive piece of work right now, but if in the future it can be considered?
Yeah.
The good news, I'll come in, Gwen, and see. Yeah, he is, I know. Gwen, see if I get this right then. Actually, Councillor Cross, this is, part of, over the next few years, we've actually been successful in securing community climate change energy project as part of Shared Prosperity Fund. And Gwen is recruited to that post, and we actually see, because we've got two roles, haven't we? We are facilitators and leaders to help with net zero carbon for 2050, and we've got that community leadership, exactly as you're saying. That's our work with our climate ambassadors, that's working district heating systems for our residents, community halls. So we've got that in place, and alongside that we're also going to have a business engagement for net zero carbon for 2050 through Shared Prosperity Fund as well. So the answer is yes, it's on our radar. We just need to get the team in place through SPF to then take forward that consistent, and I would say then, holistic county-wide energy strategy.
massively positive. This is literally come from some work that I'm doing in my portfolio. So I think there's an opportunity for UI Dave to work together and Councillor Owen, on that. But it's really positive. Thank you.
Right. Thanks. Anything to add there, Gwen?
No, I think Rachel answered that perfectly clear. But to give it even a little bit more good news is the two posts, the community decarbonised officer and the business decarbonised that have been advertised. We have recruited, and they will be starting later this month. So we're very keen to get them into our team and start rolling out. I mean, and again, this is thanks to Rachel and Mark's leadership. They've allowed me to increase our scope rather than just looking internally. It is to start looking externally to that wider county support, which is very much part of our Net Zero 2050 agenda.
Yeah, great. That is important to be a leader in the community as well as doing the right thing ourselves. Any other questions before I move to summary? Well, that sounds, in summary, that journey that we're making, the reduction from 8,100 tonnes to 6,600 tonnes over 2 years is really welcome news. That 19% reduction, and the fact that we're one of the strongest local authorities, and that is really welcome. But I think we all recognise there's much more work to do to meet that 2030 target and the 2050 target that you've talked about. I think the 4 work streams are really encouraging. I think the annual review process is important. I think we've got the right intentions. Just that practical approach to delivery is key, and the extra officer support and the climate reserve are welcome sort of mechanisms to help deliver that and to drive pace in what we do there. I think we've heard today about the importance of ambition in what we do as well. I'd certainly welcome further updates to Cabinet in the future to talk about how we can make sure that we're maximising all the potential future savings on this, because it's not only a good thing in terms of our climate obligations, but also in terms of the council's finances too. So I'd really welcome feedback on this on an ongoing basis, if that's okay. With which I'll move to the recommendations then. Paragraph 8, that Cabinet adopts the Project Apollo energy saving programme and its 4 work streams, that Cabinet approves the use of £150,000 of funding from the Climate Reserve Fund in 23-24 to initiate the 4 work streams and establish the electrical and mechanical design framework. Thirdly, that Cabinet approves £40,000 of funding from the Climate Reserve Fund in 23-24 and £40,000 in 24-25 to temporarily fund an officer post to support the delivery of the programme. And lastly, that Cabinet agrees in principle to draw on the Climate Reserve Fund as match funding for the Welsh Government Capital Heat Grant. If our application to the grant is successful, a further report will be forthcoming with all the relevant financial details. So we're all happy to approve that report. That's carried unanimously, and thank you to Gwen, to Mark and to Rachel, as well as to Mandy for their work on this. If we move then to agenda item 8, which is the LUF project management-led multidisciplinary design service contract. If I hand over initially to Jo on this.
Thank you. So in March 2022, the Strategic Director for Economy and the Environment approved the appointment of a project management-led multidisciplinary consultant design services for submitting a bid to the UK Government's Levelling Up Fund with awards based on the first 2 stages. In January 2023, our UK Government Levelling Up funding bid was approved for a cafe quarter and works to the adjacent car park in Pontypool. In accordance with the Council's financial standing order, this report is to note the variation of the consultant contract for project management-led multidisciplinary design services. And I'll hand over to Rachel for more detail.
A bit of a strange one, this for members, because it is just as the monitoring officer advised, this is for information. The contract has been awarded. It's just because it was exceeded the financial envelope as approved and commissioned. But it's really important, I'm sure Dave would say it more than me, that this is awarded to allow us to proceed on and take forward the levelling up projects in Pontypool. So there's nothing further to add.
Thanks both. Any questions, members? David?
suppose a more general question, really, because I think there's a current, not trend, but we're seeing a lot of capital projects are going up in their quotes from contractors. I wonder if you could give a more general overview of why that's happening, because I think I think it's important for us to explain to the public why this is happening and why we're having to. Why we're battling with these sorts of increases. So I think maybe more, it's not specifically about this, but generally.
I think just on this one, this is obviously to get us to REBA 4, and then we'll get the quote then for the build and the works. But there is just so much work out there at the moment that is literally name your price time, and the market is so hot and competitive. And the private sector are picking and choosing and are then, increasing their rates. Planners, engineers, their premium now is significant. Now we are seeing the beginnings of where places are beginning to put projects on hold because of escalating costs. And that's as much from the design side, which is what we're currently in, to also then the build side. And obviously the big one is the HS2, obviously being put on hold. The inflation in the market is like nothing the construction sector have ever seen, and some of our officers have been in there a long time, and the contract indices which used to be reliable from 1 month to another is literally out of date the day it's published. Contractors are refusing to hold prices sometimes for more than 24 hours. And we've actually got that, and I've seen that on some of our schemes as well. So if you think about when you're saying, right, I'm going to sign a contract now, but I'm actually not going to put the steel up until next year, trying to get a contractor to commit today for delivery of a project next year. And even ourselves at home, if we were managing our own budget at home, would we be committing to a price for next year if we were selling any commodity? So the key issues are, I think there's globally, pandemic, and obviously then works was put on halt, and then there's a catch-up and then saturation of the market. In the UK, we already had a lack of some of these skills, so it became very competitive because the fewer you have of them. So that's a real issue. The war in Ukraine has also made particularly, some materials very scarce. There was a huge delay, obviously, of materials coming forward. And obviously, I am going to say it is the B word as well in terms of Brexit. So I think there's just this overall price. And this global, now in the UK, the inflation is everything, isn't it? And so, if wages are going up, then they've got to charge more. And it's that, and I'm no economist, but I can see that if we want the construction industry to have fair wages, we're going to have to pay more as a council for those people to come and build those sites. So I think it's just everything. And it's no different for us building something than a householder having their extension done. It's just ours are just slightly bigger projects. I think it's about us in the future being creative with our procurement. And I know for some of our other projects, we are looking at going more for open procurements rather than coming off frameworks. The beauty of frameworks is that those people have already gone through pre-qualification, so it speeds up the procurement process, and that work has been done in terms of those due diligence for those companies, that they're robust enough to withstand some of that investment and the risks of a long-term project. So yeah, that's my view. I hope that's helpful.
No, that's really helpful. Thank you for that, Rachel.
Thanks, Sue.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. On the same theme, in terms of any implications of these sort of very volatile costs on delivery, are we able to look down the road and look at a range of options for still delivering the project, but potentially with variation? Has much thinking been done around those delivery implications to make sure we can manage them and still deliver something?
Hey, Councillor Morgan, I'll pick that up if that's okay. So, yeah, what we're asking for here is the contract variation. So that's the reason that this report's been presented for information. So it's a report to make sure that we're remaining in compliance with contract standing orders rather than significant variation to the price across the duration of the project. So the contingencies that we have in place on that project are sufficient to be able to cover off these sort of issues. in terms of projects of this scale on Levelling Up Fund, we will always have the option to be able to value engineer components out of those projects, the choice of materials, for example, as we progress through those projects. What we don't know at this stage is the scale of construction inflation that we'll face when that project goes out to tender, and whether that ability to value engineer will be capable of addressing that shortfall. So we do have tools in our arsenal to be able to do that, and at this stage, those projects are still going forward as proposed. And the contingencies are there to allow that. So we're not having any intelligence coming through to tell us that those projects aren't deliverable at this stage. And if we do, as we progress through that design process, get further feedback that the prices may escalate above that envelope, then we'll look at value engineering, and only at that point will we then look at any major changes to the objectives of those projects. Thanks
very much, Dave.
Thank you all. Are we okay then to move to the recommendation at paragraph 8.1? To inform Cabinet, in accordance with the Council's financial standing orders, and the following variation of the consultant contract for the project management-led multidisciplinary design services, the variation exceeds the contract by 10%. We're all happy to note that. That's carried. Thank you. The next agenda item is the exclusion of the press and public.